Very good. All right. Thank you, Marius, and thank you, Karen, and everyone. Oops. Let's first do this. Who is here and who should now be able to see this presentation. I can even make it look better by pushing this button, I think. Can you see that? Is it here? All right.
Now we do.
I'll tell you something about the size of nations. Sorry?
It's good.
Danke. Yeah, wonderful. The size of nations. So how big is a country? How big is the state? And also how are people living there? And so these are 4 points that I shortly want to address. Quite intriguing how the number and the size of nations on the world map has changed over the last centuries. And there is some economic theory which mostly started in the 1960s about, quite generally, research on small states. Do small states need a larger share of government, and can they be successful? It's mostly about economies of scale, and the neoclassical economic theory would kind of predict that small states have mostly disadvantages, but not many advantages there. And I contrast this with generalizable, perhaps empirical findings, and especially to the case of Liechtenstein. So Liechtenstein is a case of falsification of much of what Alessina and Roderick have claimed about the relevance of population. I love maps, as Gerhard already knows, and if you look at simply this part of Europe, you could see that the size and the number of states has changed dramatically over the decades, and in the last 70 years, well, after World War II, the number of sovereign states has multiplied quite significantly. There have been 74 sovereign states, and now we are almost at 200. And over 100 of them have a population below 3 million number of citizens. And one of the easy explanations is geopolitics, the breakdown of the Habsburg Empire and the Soviet Empire, decolonialization, the second wave of globalization, and international integration. So international integration, economic integration made it more likely or worthwhile for smaller countries to be formed or to succeed from larger empires. And we have seen relatively peaceful times and some smart policies that allowed these small countries, not every small country, but at least some, and mostly in Europe, to succeed. Economic theory would first of all tell you that there are quite significant economic disadvantages for a small country to be competitive on a world market, because there's less space for diversification, for division of labor. The division of labor is limited by the size of the market, the old Adam Smith thing. So there should not be as many opportunities for also large-scale production and diversification of production and organization. And if you look at the production of public goods, it's quite obvious that you have higher per capita or higher per taxpayer costs to produce a public good, which is then available to everyone. Kuznets, however, also refers to some political or political economic advantages of small states. He says they tend to have more homogeneous populations and closer internal ties, which can translate into social capital, which has been shown to be quite a positive contributor to investment and other things. And small states should show more adaptability and readiness to learn and reform. And this has also been mentioned by Katzenstein in an interesting book comparing different kinds of small state governance. And but Cameron and Roderick again point to the fact that small states have a higher vulnerability to changes in terms of trade and trade conditions, and both of them therefore think that the state has to intervene more and to ensure its citizens against these external shocks, which can not be met as easily as in a large state with a large diversified economic structure. And all this is pretty much summed up by Alesina and Spolaure in their famous book, The Size of Nations. And they also very much stress these disadvantages of size, saying that larger populations are associated with higher heterogeneity of preferences. Wait, these are, I have to start with this one, the benefits of size. So what is good if you live in a larger countries? Again, the economies of scale in the production of public goods. Think of coordination and administration of general policy of defense, foreign policy, the legal and judicial systems, police and crime prevention, the monetary financial system. All there you would expect to see economies of scale in the production of public goods. And larger countries should be better able to internalize cross-regional shocks, and regulation distribution should be easier to cope with. And the size of the internal market I've already mentioned. The only disadvantage of size or benefit of a smaller population would be the larger heterogeneity of preferences, again, like preference cost in Buchanan and Tarlock. And especially if you have a large nation with ethno-linguistic fractionalism, then it is quite likely that economic performance, social capital and other things are not as well as in a smaller, more compact state. And the other thing is a rather obvious public choice argument that the citizens in small democracies have better opportunities to observe and control government inaction, and therefore that the provision of public goods should be more in accordance to the preferences of a large majority of the people. The empirics say that quite surprisingly, small states have higher per capita income and also a higher life expectancy and education level than larger states. So this is somehow contradicting what Alesina and others, and certainly Roderick, predicted. And a basic explanation is the openness of trade. Of course, as a small country, you have to have very open borders to trade, and you very much rely on globalization and the integration in the division of labor globally, or at least with your immediate neighbors. Tom Krieger, who's also a member of our network, I think, he published a very recent paper where he looked at 130 different countries over a long time period. And he showed that also the public good production argument is not quite valid, and that smaller states also have smaller government in terms of government expenditure as a relation to GDP. So they even are more likely to be small governments. And here I depicted, you see here, this ranking from 1 to down there is according to the GDP per capita. so the wealth of the citizens per capita. And here, in fact, you see Liechtenstein is #1, and with a population size of only 38,000 inhabitants. Next is Monaco, which is also a very small state, very high income per capita. And here you see the government expenditure to GDP, the size of government column, which for some countries you don't get serious data, but it is quite intriguing that the richest countries in the world, except for the USA, they are all more or less small states. There are below 10 million inhabitants, and whereas the larger states and still comparatively wealthy ones are here. But if we look at the bottom of the line, where you get a GDP per capita below 1,000, say, you also find some small states. So being small is not an advantage per se, but certainly for these countries up here, small is somewhat beautiful if you think that wealth is to be measured in terms of GDP per capita. Here again, you see the share of government expenditures to GDP. And of course, you find the usual suspects here with France, but also comparatively small states, the Scandinavian states, who seem to have a preference then for larger government. And it looks differently if you don't compare government expenditure to the GDP, certainly for very rich countries. But if you compare it to the population itself, so government expenditures per capita, the picture looks quite different. You see here Luxembourg, which has small government in relationship to GDP, has a rather large government in terms of expenditures per capita. And if I would have to put Liechtenstein in this column of the IMF, you would find it in terms of government expenditures per GDP, somewhere here below Ireland, as really one of the lowest, smallest governments. But if you look at it in terms of per capita, it would be ranked quite highly with a number of around 30,000 behind Luxembourg, but in the area of Norway, Denmark, and others. Now let me introduce this strange country, Liechtenstein. A little bit of history, perhaps. It's in fact the only member state of the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, but you've seen it on the map there, to still exist with the same name in exactly the same territory for over 300 years. And it always had alliances. As you can see, it borders Austria and Switzerland. And as the princely family comes from Austria and had most of its possessions there in Bohemia, close to the hub, and is married to the Habsburg families over and over. The natural ally for a customs treaty and for legal assistance and so on was Austria. In 1868, Liechtenstein abandoned its army, which is also an interesting story to tell. In 1866, Liechtenstein sent out some 80 soldiers to defend the Austrian Empire against Italian aggression, but they came back with 81 because on the way they made a friend from Austria, and he wanted to live and work in Liechtenstein. And that's why 2 years later, they decided we actually don't need an army. We are surrounded by friends, and it's been a pretty much high on the country's budget. It cost almost more than a third of public expenditures was on defense for these 80 guys. In 1921, there was a new constitution um, that declared Liechtenstein a constitutional hereditary monarchy on a democratic and parliamentary basis. And this is also one of the rare countries that still has a more than 100 years old constitution. After the First World War, the alliance with Austria, the whole empire collapsed, the currency collapsed, and so on. Liechtenstein found it wise, and it was wise, to turn west to Switzerland and do pretty much the same thing, have a customs treaty and a currency union with Switzerland. And further on, it much more integrated into the international relations. And especially important is the accession to the EEA, the European Economic Area. Now, perhaps if you were to think, what is your first thing that comes to your mind if you think about Liechtenstein? It is, huge banks and letterboxes and but in fact, Liechtenstein is one of the most industrialized countries in the world, with a share of manufacturing of over 40% of gross value added. So it is much more diversified than you think. If you know someone with false teeth, the likelihood that these are produced in Liechtenstein is very high. I think the large majority of false teeth are actually produced in Liechtenstein itself. And this is employment statistic for quite a while, and you can see that total employment has increased tenfold. And the interesting thing is that you have more people actually working in Liechtenstein than the population of Liechtenstein. So there's much of inward commuting, actually from Switzerland mostly. So Liechtenstein employs many Swiss guest workers, which is something also fascinating, perhaps. And the budget is also an amazing thing. My last book was on the Liechtenstein budget over 100 years or so. Usually, the revenues are much higher than government expenditures, and that includes social insurance, right? There's the country, there's the communes, consists of 12 villages, and all of them make a budget surplus, and this budget surplus creates a stock of reserves that would hold for 3 years usual expenditures. And in the old 100-year-old constitution, it is said that the financial situation of the state, why is that, must be improved to the utmost possible extent, and every effort must be made to open up new sources. Oops, sorry about that. New sources of revenues to meet public needs. And in the early 20th century, selling stamps was good for almost 40% of state revenues, was simply by printing stamps and selling them to collectors. On the map on the right side, you can see the casino, where you find casinos on Google Map in the area, and you can see it's you can almost make out the border of Liechtenstein by these red red points that they point to casinos in Liechtenstein today. And now, how can we explain that Liechtenstein has such a huge GDP per capita, and also that it does pretty well to produce a very decent social state and to provide at least most public goods like any perfect welfare state or productive state as any other. And there I think it is useful to use this distinction between the state as a provider and arranger of public goods. And it does not have to be a producer or supplier of these goods. And Liechtenstein does that quite a bit by outsourcing the production of public goods to neighboring countries. So it has a stable currency, but simply by adopting the Swiss franc, it is a rather very secure country, but it doesn't have to spend any Swiss franc on defense. It has a very educated population, but most of the Liechtensteiners go to universities in Switzerland and some also in Austria. And the Liechtenstein government pays for it. It pays for the use of universities, but not for the establishment of universities, although it has a few. It can use the air traffic of Zurich Airport, postal services, telecom, clinics, diplomatic services are also pretty much provided by Switzerland. And you could say, so you tell me Liechtenstein is free riding on public goods produced by others. Indeed, in a way you could say so, but Liechtenstein pays, and it pays into different funds to establish these public services. And they can be provided for an extra, say, 30,000 people at very little extra marginal costs for these neighbors. Outsourcing also happens quite a bit to the private sector. For example, the local bus service is a natural monopoly. You cannot have much competition there in this small country, but Liechtenstein refers to a franchise bidding, like a DEMSETS mechanism to give a license for 10 years to different private service providers. There's also lots of local charity in social services going on, in culture and education. So Liechtensteiners feel somehow obliged to get something back and organize them on a very local and very often private basis. A rather tricky thing is that utilities and the state, partly state-owned bank are, these kinds of public-private are in mixed public and private ownership, and they produce lots of profits, which then go into the government's coffers. But whether that is what the state is there for is a question, especially if it obstructs possible competition. But then at the same time, in a very small country where the relevant market is extremely small, especially when it comes to public services, it is very difficult to avoid natural monopolies, right? And therefore, I would argue that more franchise bidding of natural monopoly should be recommended. Multitasking is also important if we want to organize the administration of the production of public goods or the provision of it. The government consists of 5 ministries, and some have a huge portfolio of very different kinds of political aspects, but it is quite amazing how well it still works. Industrial policy is a very nasty word for classical liberals, but in a way, it is unavoidable for a small state that wants to succeed. There are also some pretty good, usual things like general factors for the location of business. Liechtenstein has a central location, it's neutral. The political, legal, and social stability is something that many investors here cherish. It has a strong and stable currency. It has full access to the European single market. It has pretty good trade deals as a member of EFTA and as a part of the customs union with Switzerland. It also has free trade deals with China, which not even the EEA has. And it always invested in infrastructure. In addition, you know, if you look at the OICAM principles, you know, you need private property, free contracting, liability, a stable currency, open markets, and a continuity of economic policy. That's exactly what you find in Liechtenstein, certainly much more than in Germany. In addition to low taxation, a high banking secrecy was a big positive factor for the country. Now it has changed its policy quite remarkably, and now it boasts its high compliance with international standards when it comes to control of bank and also transparency of banking business. Still, low compliance costs are another factor, the easy access to administration, and yeah, and the kind of investments. With 6.5% of GDP, Liechtenstein had the highest share of research and development expenditures. And then again, mostly coming from the private sector. So this is a niche policy to get into these high research and development dependent sectors, and they also invest very heavily in education and also in their international reputation. One perhaps even last aspect I want to address is the prince and the people. As I said, these are the bearers of the state powers. That's how it stands in the constitution. And if you look at the history, the former Prince of Liechtenstein, Joseph, he very much encouraged state action, and the people didn't want to have unemployment assurance and lots of health insurance. But the prince encouraged them to still vote for it, and if they don't vote for it, they don't get it. So Liechtenstein has a huge potential for direct democracy, and as we know from most studies into direct democracy in Switzerland, where you get many more data points, you can see that direct democracy is a brake on government expenditures, debt, and tax increases. However, the ideology, or the philosophy of the head of state has changed in recent times. The Prince Hans Adam has published a book which I find interesting, and you can get many interesting quotes from it in my book, on the state in the third millennium, where he makes very strong classical liberal case in favor of subsidiarity of the state as a service enterprise, and of local responsibility for social care, for education, vouchers, pretty much like a compassionate libertarianist minimal state kind of concept that he developed. Now, my almost last point is on, but Liechtenstein and the world. It's soon Christmas, and if you are looking for a very funny, fancy Christmas present, I recommend the book Maritime Law in Liechtenstein. It's basically a notebook. It has, I think, 150 pages, and they're all empty. So you can put your notes down, and that's the only printed page here. And it says, Liechtenstein does not maintain a ship register, and it is not possible to sail under the Liechtenstein flag in foreign or international waters. The Principality is part of the European Economic Area and would have to implement thousands of pages of EU legislation if it ever registered a single ship. The government has always avoided this trouble. So there's many things that Liechtenstein does not have to do, and also because it is double landlocked, it doesn't make much sense. But Still, then there's an issue that I try to deal with on imported government growth. The membership of the EEA overall is a great benefit for Liechtenstein, but it also reaches perhaps some frontiers, also some limits of state size compatibility. You know, if pretty much every day you have to deal with two new acts of European law, how do you do that? And in Liechtenstein, it's mostly done by copy-paste legislation. So they don't really print these legislations in their law books, but they send out a monthly newsletter with all the links to the new directives and regulations of the European Union based on their membership of the EEA. And of course, it does not imply the whole acquis communautaire of the European Union, but more and more, and that's becoming a problem. More and more European legal acts are seemingly having a single market relevance and are important to support the four freedoms, whereas this might sometimes be dubious. It includes taxes and social insurance and stuff that from a strict subsidiarity point of view are not necessary to have free and fair trade. And then more and more, especially in financial markets, is being organized by agencies in which EFTA countries do not have a representation. So here you get regulation without representation, which is not true for the single market part, but has become a problem somehow that you know, Liechtenstein has to adopt much more laws and regulations than it would otherwise have done as such a small state. And here, finally, this is my final slide. Gerhard already knows it. This is the Europe as it actually looks like. And Liechtenstein is there on the lower left corner. So it has a currency and customs union with Switzerland. It's part of the EFTA, of the association. And other than Switzerland, it is also part of the European Economic Area. Then it is also part of the Schengen area. So in a way, you could say it's cherry picking the right arrangements that are good for it. It's also part of the Council of Europe, of course, but that way to organize things so far for Liechtenstein has been, I think, a key for its economic and political developments. And perhaps I stop with this, just show you. I can make this thing available to you, so you can also check the references that I used. But it might even be better if you read the whole book. If you can read German, you will enjoy it tremendously. And yeah, with that, I'll thank you for your attention. Also, Stefan, yeah, let's see.